Do not approach. Sector Null is death. They are the Devourers. Run while you still can.
There was a ghost sector in the Outer Reach. Every spacefaring civilization knew about it. None of them talked about it directly. Not in open channels, not in diplomatic exchanges, not even in the hushed, careful conversations that happen between old navigators in dark station bars after enough drinks to loosen something fundamental. You referenced it sideways. You planned routes around it. You taught your children and your children's children the same lesson in the same words across a dozen different species and 1,000 different languages. Don't go to Sector Null. The Calthari had a prayer for ships that strayed too close. The Somnari, beings of pure consciousness who feared almost nothing physical, maintained a standing collective grief state for the systems within its borders, a perpetual mourning for the dead. The Vreth Expansion Authority, which had conquered 40 worlds in 4 centuries and classified nothing in the known galaxy as beyond their ambition, had a single notation in their navigation database for Sector Null. The notation was one word: forbidden. Not dangerous, not contested, not under survey. Forbidden. The way a wound is forbidden to be touched. The way a nightmare is forbidden to be spoken aloud before sunrise, in case the speaking brings it back. What lived in Sector Null had no proper name in any galactic language. The closest translation from the oldest Calthari records, text carved in a stone on a planet that no longer existed, was something like the ones who were here before. Most species, over the millennia, had settled on something simpler. The Devourers. They were ancient, older than any civilization currently drawing breath in the galaxy. Older, some xenobiologists believed, than the concept of civilization itself. They moved between systems and vessels that weren't quite ships, structures that seemed to be partly biological, partly architectural, and entirely wrong in a way that made Vreth science officers file incident reports using the phrase reality adjacent before they disappeared. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They did not appear to want anything that any living species could identify or offer. They simply arrived. And after they arrived, there was nothing left. In 10,000 years of recorded galactic history, 37 civilizations have been destroyed by the Devourers. Some had tried to fight. The records of those attempts were brief and ended abruptly in ways that told you everything you needed to know. No species had ever survived a direct encounter. No species had ever driven them back. No species had ever understood what they were. Humanity joined the Galactic Conclave on a Thursday afternoon, or what passed for a Thursday in the Universal Time Standard, with considerably less ceremony than their new colleagues thought appropriate for the occasion. The human delegation arrived 20 minutes late, blamed an issue with the docking clamps, immediately requested the location of a nearest food vendor, and within an hour had somehow started a card game in the antechamber with a Calthari cultural attaché and 2 Somnari translators who technically did not have hands, but had apparently developed enough interest in the concept of poker to improvise. Ambassador Dr. Chen Jiaming was 63, compact, and possessed of a smile that his diplomatic counterparts would spend years trying to decode. He had spent 30 years as a xenobiologist before transitioning to the Foreign Service, and he carried that background everywhere. The permanent, slightly unsettling interest of a person who looks at everything in the universe and thinks primarily about how it works. His first formal act as ambassador was to request a complete copy of the Conclave's xenobiological database. His second was to ask, very casually, about Sector Null. The chamber went so quiet that the ventilation system became audible. Ambassador Velskara of the Calthari, who had been prepared to be patient with the humans, as one is patient with the newly arrived, looked at Dr. Chen with an expression that her species usually reserve for things they found incomprehensible. "You have been a member of this conclave for 4 hours," she said. 3 hours and 40 minutes, Chen corrected pleasantly. "I've been curious since before we arrived. Honestly, we picked up some unusual energy signatures from that region on the transit in. The spectral analysis is genuinely fascinating. There's a quantum chromatic pattern in the emission data that doesn't match any natural phenomenon in our astrophysical literature. I was hoping you could point me toward whoever's been studying it." Velskara stared at him for a long time. Nobody, she said at last, studies Sector Null. Chen's smile shifted almost imperceptibly from diplomatic to something more genuine, more personally interested. Nobody, he said. And the way he said it was not disbelief. It was something closer to the tone a person uses when they've just found the thread they were looking for. Nobody who survived, Velskera clarified, and her voice carried something raw underneath the formality. Ancient pain, civilizational trauma passed down across millennia. Chen looked at her. The card game had stopped in the antechamber. The room was listening. Well, he said, and there was no arrogance in it, no bravado, just the steady, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who had spent 63 years finding the world more interesting than frightening. That seems like a problem we should probably try to fix. It took 14 months to get conclave authorization. It would have taken longer, but Chen was patient in the specific, implacable way of a person who has decided the outcome is inevitable and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. He spent those 14 months in the conclave archives, reading everything. Every account of every Devourer encounter in recorded galactic history. Every scientific analysis, every military report, every desperate transmission cut off mid-sentence. He read the Kelthari stone texts in translation. He read the Somnari grief records. He read, with particular attention, the failed military engagements, the 11 documented cases where a species had attempted to fight back. Most species, reading those records, had taken from them the lesson: fighting does not work. Chen took from them something else. He brought 3 humans with him to Sector Null. His own request, a small team, he'd argued, less detectable, more maneuverable. The Conclave had wanted to send an observer fleet of 40 ships. He'd talked them down to a single human scout vessel and 1 Kelthari liaison craft that would hold position at the sector boundary and wait. The liaison was a young Kelthari officer named Tereth Sol, who had volunteered for the assignment with the specific energy of someone demonstrating that they were not afraid, which meant they absolutely were. "You understand," Tereth Sol said, when they met on the station, "that nothing that has entered Sector Null has returned." 26 of the 37 cases, yes, Chen said. The other 11 turned back before penetrating more than 2 light years in. No termination event. Tereth Sol stared at him. "That is not the reassuring statistical point you seem to think it is. It tells us there's a threshold," Chen said, "which tells us there's a boundary, which tells us the behavior is territorial, not predatory." He smiled. "That's actually quite reassuring once you look at it that way." He invited Tereth Sol aboard the human vessel for the transit to the sector boundary. The Kelthari spent most of the journey watching the 3 human crew members with an expression that suggested she was deeply uncertain whether she was witnessing extraordinary courage or a neurological deficiency that made humans unable to properly experience fear. She was not wrong that something unusual was happening. She was wrong about what it was. Humans experienced fear normally, completely normally. The human crew of the ISCS inquiry were afraid. Dr. Chen included, though he managed his in the way of a lifelong scientist by focusing on what he didn't know yet and how much he wanted to. They just kept going anyway. They found the first Devourer vessel 6 hours inside the sector boundary. There were no words adequate for it. Tereth Sol's report would later describe it as a structure approximately 4 kilometers in length, exhibiting biological and architectural characteristics simultaneously, generating an EM signature consistent with active cognitive processes, and producing in observers a profound psychological response best described as the complete certainty that one is in the presence of something very old and not indifferent to one's existence. The human crew used slightly different language. "Okay," said Lieutenant Commander Yara Santos, the inquiry's pilot, in a very controlled voice. "That's a thing. Record everything," Chen said. His voice was quiet and absolutely focused. "Every spectrum. Full sensor sweep. Yara, hold position. Don't approach. Don't retreat." "It's moving," Yara said. "I know. Hold." The Devourer vessel was turning toward them. Slowly, with the terrible patience of something that had never, in 10,000 years, been in a hurry because nothing had ever required it to be. In the liaison craft at the boundary, Tereth Sol was on the emergency channel. Dr. Chen, you need to withdraw. You need to withdraw now. Not yet, Chen said. Doctor, Tereth Sol, look at the emission pattern on your sensors. His voice was the same, still, focused, carrying the specific gravity of a person who has seen something they've been looking for a very long time. Look at the spectral signature. Not the structure, the emission. Tell me what you see. A long pause. I'm not sure what I'm looking at. It's a distress signal, Chen said. The bridge of the inquiry went completely silent. That's a chromatic pattern consistent with a biological stress response, Chen continued. And now, there was something in his voice, not excitement exactly, something deeper and quieter than excitement, the particular tone of someone who has just understood something that changes everything. I've been looking at the emission data for 14 months. It's not an attack pattern. It's not a hunting signature. He stopped. It's been calling. For 10,000 years, it's been calling. Calling for what? Yara whispered. Chen was already at the communications panel. Not the standard broadcast array, the deep-frequency resonance transmitter he'd had installed at his own specification, the one that the Conclave's tech team had built to his design and quietly assumed was an eccentricity. He'd built it to match the frequency of the chromatic emission pattern. He'd built it, in 14 months of archive research, to answer. What happened next took 11 minutes and would be analyzed for the next 200 years. The Devourer vessel stopped. Its EM signature changed, shifted from the active, angular pattern that every historical engagement had recorded as a precursor to an attack, and resolved into something that the inquiry's computer, after 17 seconds of processing, classified with a notation that would become the most famous line in xenobiological literature. Pattern consistent with biological recognition response. Possible identification of known signal source. Chen transmitted again. The same frequency. A longer sequence this time, built from the patterns in the archive data. Responses, progressions, the mathematical bones of a language that had been screaming into the void for 10 millennia with nothing screaming back. The Devourer answered. Not in any language. Not in anything that could be translated directly. Not then, not for years afterward. But the sensors lit up with a response transmission of such complexity and duration that the inquiry's entire data storage was consumed in the first 4 minutes, and Yara was frantically routing to backup arrays to capture the rest. And the vessel, the ancient, terrible vessel that had hunted 37 civilizations to extinction, stayed still. It did not attack. It did not leave. It waited. Epilogue. It took 6 years to establish something resembling a communication framework. 12 more years to begin to understand what the Devourers were. Not predators, not conquerors, but something for which no galactic language had an adequate word. The nearest translation, developed by a joint team of human and Keltheri xenolinguists, was caretakers in grief. Species so ancient they predated the current cycle of galactic civilization. Beings who had watched countless civilizations rise and collapse over billions of years, who carried within their biological consciousness the memory of species long dead. Carried it the way a person carries a loss that never fully heals, as a weight, as a presence, as something that needed to be expressed and had no one to express it to. The deaths. The 37 civilizations. They had not been hunted. They had been approached by beings who communicated through biological resonance frequencies that no other species in the galaxy had developed the sensory range to perceive, whose contact, though intended as communication, had produced in other species' neurological systems a catastrophic overload. Not predation. Tragedy. 10,000 years of tragedy, and no one who could hear them to explain. Until a 63-year-old human xenobiologist with a custom-built transmitter and 14 months of archive data had held very still in the dark and answered back. Chen received the Conclave's highest honor in a ceremony he was 40 minutes late to, citing a fascinating biological anomaly he'd observed in the station's atmospheric processing unit and had stopped to photograph. In his acceptance remarks, He said something that would be translated into 47 languages and carved into the entrance of the Conclave's new Xenobiological Research Center, the one built at the edge of what was no longer called Sector Null. The galaxy did not have monsters. It had a species that was trying to speak, and no one patient enough to listen. That is the only kind of monster that has ever truly frightened me. Not the unknown, but the known thing we refuse to understand. He paused and smiled and added, also, the emission data from those atmospheric processors is genuinely extraordinary. Someone should look into that. On the front row, Ambassador Terrace Sol of the Kel Theory, who had spent 6 years working alongside the human team, who had learned to read Chen's particular variety of calm, and who had stopped being afraid of it approximately 18 months into the process, covered what functioned as her face with what functioned as her hand. And somewhere in the deep dark of what had been Sector Null, ancient lights moved slowly through the black, no longer alone, carrying their grief and their memory through a galaxy that had finally, at last, begun to listen.